As co-chair of this high-level dialogue, it is a great honor, and I also have to say, together with Damilola and my colleague, Mr. Liu Jimin, to actually be on this day and to see this high-level dialogue on energy happening. This is not only a seminal moment for the world when we talk about energy, it is also a moment, as we have already heard from the speakers before me, a moment in which seismic shifts are happening. And I would argue that in many respects, the energy revolution that underpins both the objectives of access to energy and the transition towards a clean energy future is already underway. As Francesco just now said, it is an opportunity that is right before us, and indeed in many parts of the world is already being seized. This high-level dialogue is a deliberate attempt to also return to the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 7, because it was in 2015 that energy was recognized as fundamental to development, to sustainable development, but also to the other goals that are embedded in the 2030 agenda. Sustainable Development Goal 7 is about access to energy. When 800 million people across the planet still do not have access to electricity in the 21st century, this is simply something that is neither acceptable, nor is it something that we cannot solve. Secondly, it was the clean energy transition that SDG 7 focused on, and it also highlighted the potential of energy efficiency. But at the heart of this, and you have heard this from all our speakers this morning, beginning with our Secretary General, we have to ensure that everyone can reap the benefits. Too much of the 20th century history of energy and electricity infrastructure development actually implied leaving too many behind. And therefore, as we are meeting in this high-level dialogue, I think that focus on, first of all, universal access to energy, and secondly, the energy transition, the just transition, as a number of you have also alluded to, is critical. This is a time for disruption. It is not always something that is comfortable to those who are established. And we have seen that our energy systems, our historic energy infrastructure, to some extent is often deeply ingrained in the fabric of our countries, making these transitions, first of all, difficult, and even in countries with a great deal of energy resources, fossil fuel resources, not achieving universal energy access. It is critical that we also recognize the potential of energy efficiency. We could be reducing global emissions by 40% if we actually enacted all the measures that are at our disposal. And this is part of the decarbonization path of our global economy, but also for every country. We could create 30 million jobs by the year 2030 if indeed we followed through on the targets that are in SDG 7, and particularly when it comes to regions such as Africa, where well over 600 million people still do not have access to electricity, where half of the health stations do not have any access to power, where particularly in this pandemic we saw also students not being able to go to school or switch onto hybrid platforms, have access to broadband, because it simply is not there. That is what this high-level dialogue on energy is all about. And it is why we are so deeply committed in the United Nations to approach this issue from the point of view of bringing together every actor, every nation, every community, and also companies, corporations, entrepreneurs, startups. This is truly an opportunity that is enormous, but it requires ambition. That is why the energy compacts are also an illustration of how individual companies, countries, communities are now showing leadership and courage. We joined that group as the United Nations Development Programme with an unprecedented pledge for the next 4 years of contributing to connecting 500 million people to an electricity access point. This is an extraordinarily ambitious objective, but nothing else will do, both in terms of the legacy of too many having been left behind, but also the imperative to act on climate change and on decarbonization. The transition towards a clean energy future is happening everywhere, but it is happening unevenly. It is not happening fairly, and too many constraints are preventing us from meeting the needs that are actually available and solutions today. So let me close, Nisha, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to all those who are joining us today for the high-level dialogue. Heads of government, heads of state, heads of corporations, but also colleagues such as Chebet and many others across the world. This is an energy revolution in the making. Let's make sure it is fair, it is just, it is inclusive, and above all, that it is honest and ambitious enough to meet the needs of the next generation as well. In that spirit, as head of the United Nations Development Programme, but also with my co-chair as co-chair of this high-level dialogue on energy, let's make this a day where the world truly comes together and where the notions of cooperation and co-investment are as important as those of competition. Competition can be a driver for creativity, but sometimes the world needs to come together, and that is why the United Nations has today called this high-level dialogue on energy. Thank you so much.